Good. So two people were taking a nice walk down a path in the park. Suddenly things got really silent. Birds weren't singing, squirrels weren't running. They looked back, and there, behind them, was a bear. And one of them said, "You wait here, I'm going to run and get help." The other person said, "You can't outrun a bear." The person said, "Yeah, I don't have to outrun a bear, I just have to outrun you." All right. Good. I couldn't decide between those two bear jokes this morning. Whew, I like that. All right. Today we're going to continue with our, brief exploration of the historical roots of this conflict in, Israel, Palestine. As I pointed out in the last session, but I think it's still important to say again and to keep in mind. Israel kind of looms large in our global discourse. We think about it a lot, we hear about it a lot, we talk about it a lot. Israel, the Holy Land, the conflict there. And what we're talking about is it's a really tiny place. Here is the size of Israel in relation to the size of the United States. And then next to it is a size comparison between Israel and New Jersey. So when we talk about Israel as a country, as a nation state, we're talking about a very small piece of land. Does Israel have more people than New Jersey? I don't know. Wow. Yeah, that could be true. That could be true. All right. And yeah, maybe next year. Anyway. Well, and it's well, the state that's called New Jersey is named after Jerusalem. New Jersey, it means New Jerusalem. All right. So maybe people will start saying next year in the Holy Land, they'll start thinking about coming to New Jersey. Now, this little sliver of land, as I said last time, not the most productive farmland. It's kind of a dry, rocky soil. It's good, the only things you can really grow there dependably are olives and grapes, which are both crops that you can grow in kind of dry, rocky places. You can also grow sheep and goats there. It won't really support cattle, but you can grow sheep and goats. People have been living there on this piece of land, continuously for hundreds of thousands of years. When we enter the historical era, it was a place that was known as Canaan, and it quickly became a colony of Egypt, which means the Egyptians, they sent soldiers and archers, they conquered it, and they made a deal with at the time, Canaan was not one country, it was like 30 little countries. When I say it was 30 little countries, by a country I mean something about the size of a little feudal kingdom or a southern plantation. So it was about 30 of those. They had a deal with Egypt that they would send a percentage of their wine and olive oil, and that if they didn't send a share of their stuff, Egypt would send soldiers again and destroy the whole thing. Now, famously, about 1,300 years before the Common Era, some runaways from Egypt show up in Canaan. Not just runaways from Egypt. I mean, the Bible tells us that Moses and one group of people came from Egypt, probably at around the same time. The group that we would identify with Abraham, the children of Abraham, came in from Mesopotamia. And they came in here and they caused a lot of trouble and they fought, and they also seem to have kind of mixed in with the peasants, the slaves, kind of the lowest people, the nobodies of Canaan. And they, having sort of escaped from the plantations of Canaan and slavery in Egypt and being nobodies in Mesopotamia, they established themselves as these little tribal cultures in which, like, nobody really had anything, nobody got rich, and if the neighboring empires tried to threaten them, there was really nothing to take away. This then changed when we see the rise of the kingdom in Jerusalem, you know, with like David and Solomon and the kings of Judah. They do start amassing wealth. As soon as the kings start amassing wealth in Israel, then Egypt starts threatening them again. And they have to start sending some of their stuff to Egypt. And then the empires of Mesopotamia start coming down and invading and, beating people up and demanding a share of their wealth. A series of Mesopotamian empires are going to colonize Israel. It'll be the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Neo-Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians, and then the Persians. And this is just going to keep happening. Then the Persia is going to fall to the Greeks in the time of Alexander the Great. And then Greece is going to colonize Israel. And then Greece is going to wear itself out and kind of come apart. And then Rome is going to colonize Israel. So this land, and it's significant because one of the big questions in this Israel-Palestine conflict is, like, whose land is it? And whose land was it? And whose land should it be? But this piece of land, this kind of insignificant little sliver here, it's been invaded and colonized and taken over many, many, many times in this last 3,000 years. It became a colony of the Roman Empire. Roman colonies, you can see here in red. Rome was just an incredible conquering force. They conquered everything. They sent Pompey Magnus to just go into Judea. He rode in with chariots and soldiers. He took it over. And the Romans renamed it. They called it Judea, the land of the descendants of Judah. And it's from the Latin Judea that we get the word the Jews, kind of as a classification of a type of people. Then in the year 40, there was some disorganization and confusion in Rome, and some rebels in Judea, they took advantage of that situation. They banded together, they rose up, they kicked out the Roman centurions, and they managed to establish independence very briefly. And this was very big news because Roman colonies never managed to throw off Rome and declare their independence. The word of this spread throughout the empire, and people in all these other colonies suddenly started hearing about this place, Judea, that had managed to throw off Roman colonialism. And so the Romans, they got their act back together. They knew that this was going to make more problems for them. They sent a massive army there. They crucified 200,000 people. They just lined the roads with crosses. They destroyed the Jerusalem temple. Matter of fact, they tore it down stone by stone, and then they set it on fire. And the Jerusalem temple, from that day to this, There's been no temple there. And as an additional insult, the Romans renamed the land again. This time they named it Palestine. They looked back into the history of Israel for like who was the most hated enemy of the Israelites. They found the story of the Philistines who had tried to invade, and Romans said, we're going to rename the land after them. This is how, people will sometimes say like, oh, the Palestinians, meaning like the Palestinians of today, are they somehow like related to, descended from the Philistines? No, that was a Roman joke. It was just, that was like the Roman sense of humor. Now, with the temple destroyed, if you've ever tried to read through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible before, you'll find there's this constant reference to worshiping God by sacrificing animals in the temple. When the temple was destroyed, animal sacrifice was over. It was decided there's no temple anymore, so we're not going to sacrifice animals anymore. That's why if you're trying to figure out like what does it mean to be Jewish, actually reading the first 5 books, reading the Torah, is going to get you nowhere, because it's explaining a religion that ended 2,000 years ago. That was temple Judaism, and that's gone. With temple Judaism gone, we see the rise of rabbinic Judaism. Now, a priest is somebody who sacrifices animals, someone who conducts blood sacrifice. That's why in Christianity, some churches have people who are called priests. Those are people who can transform things into blood, and they can still perform blood sacrifice. Other Christian churches have somebody who's called a minister. That means that this is a person who cannot transform something into blood. They can give you bread and grape juice or wine as a commemoration of the sacrifice of Jesus, but they can't do the blood thing on the altar. Anyway, the priests are gone. The temple is gone. People need to, in Judaism, there's this kind of identity crisis of like, well, if all of the texts tell us that our religion cannot be conducted without making sacrifices, what do we do? And they start turning to teachers, people who are called teacher. And the Hebrew word for teacher is rabbi. And the rabbis started debating and talking about what can we do, what can we offer if we're not sacrificing animals anymore. This is the birth of what we know today as rabbinic Judaism. That is Judaism not of priests and a temple and animal sacrifice, but Judaism of teachers, rabbis, who will say, this thing has happened, the Torah says you need to kill 2 doves on the altar, we're not doing that anymore. Instead, you can give to the poor, or you can do this thing, you can do this thing. So Judaism goes through a dramatic change. And in this way, modern Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, is about the same age as Christianity. They got started at the same time with the destruction of the temple. When Rome destroyed the temple, they declared that no person of Judean descent would ever be allowed on the mountain, Mount Zion, the mountain on which Jerusalem stands, again. And so, with no temple, no anchor, no homeland, and not even the right to go and look at the rubble of Jerusalem, people of Judea began kind of spreading out in the Roman Empire, and they go to different colonies. This map, somebody has put together this Jewish diaspora, this dispersion, after the destruction of the temple. The Jewish people begin establishing little communal villages in which they can sort of keep being Jewish. They can retain some of their identity, but the temple is gone. Well, good. That's a good question. They were kind of banished from Jerusalem, and so yeah, you could say that they were sort of forced out. They were sort of exiled, or that there was really no reason to stay there. But I should note here, there were people who stayed there. The land was still continuously occupied, because the farmers, the grape farmers, the olive oil farmers, the fishermen, the herders, like those people didn't really have anywhere to go, and they had a skill set that was only really going to help them in one place. So we hear about this dispersion. What we can forget is there were people here whose families had been like farming grapes and olives and raising sheep and goats continuously for thousands of years through all of these different occupations. And like every so often there'd be a war, the soldiers would get wiped out, or the priests would get wiped out, or the kings would get wiped out. The celebrities, the somebodies, kept on changing. But kind of the nobodies, I mean, just the ordinary people, had just continued to occupy this land, and they're always going to be there, and their descendants are still there. So we'll come back to them. About 400 years into the Common Era, this is now about 1600 years ago, the Roman Empire is just too big, it's too unwieldy, it splits. It splits into the Roman Empire with its Roman Christianity, and then the Eastern Empire, where we get the Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Palestine becomes part of the eastern side of this empire in the split. In the early 1600s, there's a prophet down here who kind of makes this announcement that Judaism is going to come back. It's going to be restored. It's going to become the biggest religion in the world, and that the Christians are going to return to it. All of the Christians are going to become Jewish again, and that the Arabs are going to become part of this new Judaism also, and that this is going to become like the big thing in world religion. The Jews in Arabia, they hear about this, they say, absolutely not. This is not going to happen. You don't represent us. Don't ever tell us that. Don't ever tell anybody that this thing you're talking about is Judaism or anything like it. And so this person, who is Muhammad, he then kind of takes this new Judaism, which is very much like the old Judaism, and it becomes something else. It becomes Islam, and it becomes this giant thing. Islam spreads incredibly quickly. Here in dark orange is Islam by the end of Muhammad's life. Muhammad went around kind of sharing this message for 20 years. And here it is at the end of his life. What we see here in yellow is 40 years later. That's 40 years after the death of Muhammad. Islam has spread here. And then by 100 years after that, everything that we see here in green. So this map is letting us know Islam spreads incredibly fast. There are people who say that Islam spread by the sword, by conquest, by force, although actually, really, people would hear about it, and they would just open up their gates. They would say, yes, this makes a lot more sense, particularly in these places that have been part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which didn't really care about them and wasn't doing anything for them. And they would kind of open up their gates and say, yeah, we'll become part of this Muslim empire. So that spreads incredibly fast. And of course, right here again is Palestine, where it wasn't that the Muslims came in and emptied the place and resettled it. The Muslims came in and they found the same grape farmers, the same olive farmers, the same, shepherds and goat herds, the same people who had kind of always been there. And these people said, yes, all of the empires have come through. Nothing has changed. Nothing has ever significantly changed for the grape farmers and the shepherds. And so they become part of the Muslim empire. As far as we can tell, they become part of it by choice. They just say, yeah, it's not going to make any difference to us. We're going to keep doing this stuff. That's why if we look at Jerusalem today, like the big eye-catching things are the mosques, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is built over this stone outcropping. There is a story in Islam in which God, Allah, once picked Muhammad up in Arabia and picked him up and then put him down in Jerusalem. And in the story, he was set down in the same place where Abraham almost sacrificed his son, Ismail, not his son Isaac, but his other son. So this becomes sacred. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Roman Empire has become the Holy Roman Empire. It's become the Roman Catholic Empire. Things have not significantly changed. There is still the expectation that everyone in Rome is going to give a share of their wealth. That everyone in the empire is going to send a share of their wealth to Rome, except this time, instead of being like the militaristic nation state, it is the Vatican and the Roman Church. In the early medieval period, the flow of wealth to Rome is threatened by overpopulation, competition, and violence. The people in the Vatican aren't getting the income that they expect. They look up around Europe, they see everybody's fighting amongst themselves. And so Pope Urban II sends out a note throughout Europe and says, basically, if you kids are going to play rough, take it outside. If you need to fight, go fight somewhere else. They say, where should we fight? He says, you know what you should do? You should go to Jerusalem, and you should go and retake. You should go take over Jerusalem. And the Pope pays for this with tickets to heaven. He just says, if you die in the crusade, or if you die on your way to the crusade, you can have an absolute, all expense paid ticket straight to heaven, no purgatory. All of your sins will be automatically forgiven. It was a pretty good deal, yeah. So people, they had to pay for their own armor, they had to pay for their own transportation, they had to pay for all that. But what they got was just this no questions asked ticket to paradise from the Pope. The Christians came, they took Jerusalem, the Muslims took it back. This happened a couple of times. Now, although the Jews were neutral in the Crusades, there was this popular Crusaders thing that if you knew that if you died in the Crusades or on your way to the Crusades, all of your sins would be forgiven, it meant that you could kind of do anything you wanted on your way there. And so they started on their way to the Crusades, just marauding Jewish villages, and kind of doing anything they could think of, in this belief that as soon as they got to Jerusalem, everything was going to be forgiven. When the Crusades end, now here is Palestine as part of the Ottoman Empire. So, like, once again, it is still part of a Muslim empire. It's still this little sliver, it's still this little pawn on the world stage. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were getting really dangerous. There were outbreaks of plague, famine, climate change. As a matter of fact, this is one of those just like horrible ironies of history. You know, Muslims have to wash themselves every time they pray. They have to wash their face and hands. So Muslims have to wash themselves 5 times a day. And the word went out in Europe that washing your face and hands was a sign of kind of becoming a Muslim. So European Christians stopped washing their faces and hands for centuries. And these were centuries of terrible plagues that tore their way through Europe. And whenever there was a plague, the Europeans would blame the Jews. And then they would go, and so it was like European Christians were so afraid to wash their hands because they didn't want to be considered Muslims. And then when that made them sick, they would go and blame the Jews for it. They would go torch some village somewhere. So there was this stuff which was going on, which was just awful. 1913, overpopulation and competition in Europe. European nations begin to industrialize. They want to start making stuff. If you're going to make stuff, you need raw materials. And so the European nations start going around and colonizing. I mean, especially, you can see Africa here in this color-coded map. It's just chunks of it are just colonized by all of these nations that need the raw materials so that they can manufacture things, so that they can industrialize. One of the last countries to get in on the industrialization is Germany. And when they decide that they want to industrialize, all of the world is already carved up. So Germany starts looking around, and what you can see here in pink are British colonies. And the Germans decide that they are going to take some of the British colonies away so that they can start getting the raw materials, so that they can get into the industrialization game. Did anybody really care about Archduke Franz Ferdinand? No, really, no, they didn't. They wanted to industrialize, they needed this stuff, and Germany decided it was going to take some of England's colonies away. This is how we got the First World War. Just suddenly all of these countries kind of lined up with each other on two sides, and they fought. But the war was fought over colonies. They wanted the raw materials. So to say, you know, the First World War, I think, is a really good example of a war in which there were no good guys. There were only bad guys. England had the colonies. They were the bad guys. Germany wanted the colonies. They were the bad guys. Everybody just wanted the stuff. The First World War killed 9 million soldiers, 7 million civilians. And when it ended, the British punished the Germans for wanting to industrialize by bombing all of their factories, by bombing all of their stuff. They used this expression, we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age, what they mean is they will never become an industrial power. They will never have the colonies or the raw materials, and they will never have the factories again. England did this, and then, in one of the stupidest moves in history, the winners of the First World War, they got together, and they were in some trouble because they had largely funded the war by borrowing money from American bankers. And so, in order to pay the Americans back, somebody had to pay for the war, and England and France decided that Germany should pay for the war. And so they sent them the bill, which was the modern equivalent of $442 billion. They said, you need to pay back every penny that was spent in this war by England and France. And that was before Germany could think about supporting itself again. This was really hard in a land that had no colonies, no industry, and no money. So now Germany, after the First World War, is going to fall into this catastrophic economic collapse. Returning to Israel and Palestine, in 1917, this is just after the end of the First World War, there is this document, it's known as the Balfour Declaration, which says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. England has won Palestine in the First World War. Among the different, among the effects of it, the Ottoman Empire has collapsed. England got all of their stuff and all of their land, including Israel, and there is this awareness in Europe that things are going to become very, very dangerous for the Jews. And the English government comes up with this idea. They say, you know what? We need to get the Jews out of Europe. We need to get them to a place where they can hide. And somebody gets this idea. We should just give them. We just won this colony of Israel. We should give it to them. They didn't do it. But this is the first time that they start talking about it. Here in red is the British Empire in 1921. You can see they already had a lot. They've won even more in the First World War. There in the little circle, there is Palestine, now part of England. In Germany, a lot of people are blaming Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, Catholics, and other outsiders for Germany's post-war economic depression. Being Jewish in Germany, it sort of meant being this little tribal community within this nation, but part of the country, but also separated by these boundaries of customs, language, holidays, foods, etc. And as we all know from history, when things go wrong, and everybody looks up here and says, who should we blame? The people who are up here are usually going to say, no, don't blame the people up here. You should really blame the people down there. This is one of those things that is still ongoing. There's a lot of trouble for the Jews in Germany. And then this person, Adolf Hitler, proposes a solution. He announces that if he is put in charge, he's going to restore German economic prosperity by deporting all of the Jews. That if they put him in charge, he's going to round up all of the Jews and send them somewhere else. He does get put in charge. And then he starts reaching out to everybody and saying, how many millions of Jews would you like? We're rounding them up and they're not staying here. How many do you want? The answer that came back from everywhere was 0. We've got our own Jews, we've got our own, nobody likes them here. You've got your Jews, nobody likes them there. They're your problem. And this is when the solution of deportation just becomes the solution of elimination, because now you've got these holding camps of people who are waiting to be deported, but there's nowhere to deport them. Then it becomes a problem that just has to disappear. We might know this as the Holocaust. Actually, in Judaism, it's not called the Holocaust because Holocaust means a voluntary sacrifice. It means when you voluntarily set an entire animal on fire as an offering. And so in Judaism, they say, like, what happened in Germany was not millions of people setting themselves on fire as a sacrifice to God. They call it this other thing, the total destruction. The Hebrew word for that is the Shoah. When the concentration camps get liberated at the end of the Second World War, that was pretty exciting, but it reintroduced this problem, which was, once again, who's going to take all of these people? Because when you liberate the concentration camps, you can't just turn people loose back in Germany and Poland. You can't send them back to the people who just tried to annihilate them. So there was once again the question, how many of these survivors does England want? How many does France want? The United States took a few, but Europe still didn't want them. And so at the end of the Second World War, Great Britain actually did this thing that they had thought about at the end of the First World War. They still owned Palestine as a colony. And in 1947, they decided that they were going to cut Palestine. What you can see here in orange was going to become an independent Jewish nation state. And what we see there in yellow, the British carved that out. And they said, Palestinians, like, you can still stay here in kind of like a reservation. One Englishman famously referred to it as a land without a people, for a people without a land. Of course, the problem was, it wasn't a land without a people. It was a land that had been continuously occupied for all of this time. And when we think about who were these people who were in Palestine at the end of the Second World War, still growing grapes and olives and sheep and goats, the answer is they were pretty much the same people who had always been there. This has never been a place that anybody really wanted to live, but people who knew how to live there had just been continuously living there for thousands of years. And, in some way we could say, like, if you did like DNA tests, like, DNA genealogy tests of like indigenous Palestinians, you would probably find like indigenous Canaanite DNA, Hebrew, like Jewish, Israelite DNA, some Philistine DNA, some DNA from the empires that came through and raided their way through. But you would basically find that it was essentially the same people who had been there all along, for whom things had never significantly changed. It was just the name of the empire that they paid their taxes to kept changing. Here is Palestine in 1946 at the end of the Second World War. You can see in dark green the Palestinians. You can see in white that there were some Jewish people living there. This is the plan that the English handed down in 1947, which was that all of these people had to kind of squeeze into here. This obviously didn't happen peacefully, and after 20 years of war, we can see this dark green, the Palestinian space getting smaller. Here it is in 2010. Now that's 13 years ago, so it just continues to shrink like that. If you ask, like, whose land is it, or who had it the longest, everybody can tell you whose land it is, even though the two people might really disagree. But everybody seems to know the answer to this question. But think about this, like, who's had it the longest, the Jews or the Muslims? The land was Israelite in the biblical period from about 1300 to about 70 of the Common Era. That put together is about 1400 years. The land has been Muslim since 690 of the Common Era, which again happens to be about 1400 years. So even to say which group, the Jews or the Muslims, has had the land for the longest, actually each one of them has had it for about the same amount of time, for about 1400 years. Both sides of this debate have intellect, and both sides of this debate have emotion. And the emotion makes it, especially difficult to remain intellectually, grounded in it. Whose land is it? I teach this to my college students in my introduction to religious studies because I think it's really important for like 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds to really think about this. Not that I expect my college students to like write this down and memorize it and like spend the next 20 years becoming an expert in it, but just to let people know this history. This is incredibly complex, and if you have like your answer about who should have the land, and it's like a simple answer, I would say there is no simple answer. Yeah, with the question of whose land is it, whose land should it be, I would say only God knows that. This conflict is going to continue. Both sides are going to feel like the underdog, like the persecuted one, like the one who is being unjustly attacked in land that obviously should be theirs. The problem is that both sides feel this way, and this conflict is likely to be ongoing until that land is rendered uninhabitable for human beings. That's the only end that I can see to it. This is, I know this is an awful lot of history. And if you have any questions, I've probably just told you everything I know. All right, but you can, if anyone does have a question, I can at least try. Yes.
Sorry, go back. Certain slides around, it feels like World War I, World War II. Right, you might have
That's all right. Well, I can answer your questions on the way home. Okay. Because we'll have time to talk about this.
Yes. So I guess that question you answered. Sorry.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. What was the size of like Israel, Palestine in relation to each other? Yeah. So this map here is the UN plan of 1947. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we don't know. Next week that could be that could be an all white map. All right. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, next time we'll do something, whatever. Our next adult ed session will be something kind of lighthearted and playful. So thank you.